You've been lied to your entire life about money. Not by criminals, not by scammers operating out of dark corners of the internet. By the most trusted voices in your life, your parents, your teachers, the financial advisors with framed diplomas on their office walls, the best-selling books that sat on every respectable bookshelf for the last 30 years. The advice they gave you felt safe. It felt responsible. It felt like the smart thing to do. And that's exactly why it worked. Because here's what nobody tells you, and what this video is going to expose completely. The financial system you were handed was never designed to make you wealthy. It was designed to make you manageable, predictable, average, and the most dangerous part. The people giving you this advice weren't lying to you. They genuinely believed every word they said, which means the trap was perfectly hidden because it was invisible even to the people setting it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand 3 things that most people will never realize in their lifetime. First, why the financial advice passed down through generations is structurally incapable of building real wealth. Second, the psychological mechanism that keeps highly intelligent, hardworking people locked inside a system that quietly caps their potential. And third, the specific shift in thinking that separates people who accumulate real wealth from people who spend 40 years following the rules and still end up anxious about retirement. This is going to feel uncomfortable at times. Good. Discomfort is where understanding actually lives. Let's start with something most people have never questioned. Think about the first financial lesson you ever received. Maybe it was a parent handing you a piggy bank. Maybe it was a teacher explaining the concept of saving. Maybe it was a guidance counselor telling you that a stable job with benefits was the goal. Whatever it was, it shared one defining characteristic. It was focused entirely on not losing, not on winning, not on building, on protecting, on being careful, on being responsible. And that framing, that foundational orientation toward money, shaped everything that came after it. The financial advice most people inherit isn't built on a philosophy of abundance. It's built on a philosophy of survival. And survival thinking, while useful in genuinely dangerous situations, is catastrophically limiting when applied to wealth building in a modern economy. Here's where the story gets complicated. This didn't happen by accident. The post-World War II economic era created the architecture of what we now call normal financial life. The 30-year mortgage, the corporate pension, the single-income household. The idea that you work for one company for decades, receive a gold watch at retirement, and then live comfortably off your savings and Social Security. This system worked for a specific window of time, for a specific group of people, in a specific economic environment that no longer exists. But the advice outlived the conditions that made it valid. And we kept teaching it. We kept passing it down. We kept calling it wisdom. Think about what happened to the pension system. In 1980, approximately 83% of private sector workers in the United States had access to a defined benefit pension plan, meaning a guaranteed monthly payment for life after retirement. By 2022, that number had collapsed to under 15%. The retirement security that safe financial advice was built around was quietly dismantled over 4 decades. But the advice didn't change. The story stayed the same. Work hard. Save diligently. Trust the system. Everything will be fine. Everything was not fine. Meanwhile, the cost of the things that matter most kept rising at rates that made traditional saving mathematically inadequate. Between 1970 and today, college tuition at 4-year universities increased by over 3,000% when adjusted for inflation. Housing in major metropolitan areas became structurally inaccessible for median income earners. Healthcare costs rose so dramatically that medical debt became the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the most economically powerful nation on earth. The landscape changed completely. The advice didn't. And here's the part that should make you stop and think. The people most hurt by the gap between the old advice and the new reality were also the most diligent followers of that advice. The people who did everything right, who saved consistently, who avoided debt, who followed every rule they were given. These were not careless people. These were not irresponsible people. They were careful, obedient people who trusted the framework they were handed. And the framework failed them silently, over decades, in ways they didn't fully realize until it was very late. That's not an accident of history. It's a design feature. Now we need to talk about the specific pieces of advice that seem the most obviously correct, and why they're actually the most dangerous. Start with the one you've heard 10,000 times. Save 10% of your income. Put it in a savings account. Be consistent. Be patient. This advice, delivered with absolute sincerity by financial educators for generations, is a masterpiece of well-intentioned misdirection. Here's the math that most people have never actually run. If you earn $60,000 per year and save 10%, you are saving $6,000 annually. Now, the average high-yield savings account in 2024 offered approximately 4.5 to 5% interest. That sounds reasonable until you account for inflation, which has averaged approximately 3.8% over the last 20 years and was significantly higher in recent years. After inflation adjustment, your real rate of return in a savings account in many environments is effectively near zero, sometimes negative. You're running in place. You're working to stay still. And the advice says this is good. This is smart. This is responsible. It gets worse when you extend the timeline. A 25-year-old who saves $6,000 per year in a standard savings account until age 65 will have accumulated roughly $240,000 in contributions. With compounding interest, accounting for realistic rates and inflation, they might finish with somewhere between $280,000 and $320,000 in actual purchasing power terms. Sounds like a lot until you realize that the average retirement in the United States now lasts 18 to 20 years. And the average cost of retirement, when accounting for healthcare, housing, and basic living expenses, is estimated at over $1.2 million for a couple. The math doesn't work. It has never worked. But the advice kept saying it did. Now compare that to someone who took the same $6,000 per year and invested it in a diversified index fund tracking the S&P 500, using the historical average return of approximately 10% annually before inflation adjustment. That same person ends up with approximately $2.7 million over 40 years. Not because they worked harder, not because they took reckless risks, because they put their money somewhere where compound growth actually operated at a meaningful rate. The difference between $300,000 and $2.7 million is not a difference in effort, it's a difference in the advice they received. But this is where everything changes, because the savings account problem, as significant as it is, isn't actually the deepest issue. The deeper issue is what advice like this does to your thinking, what it does to your relationship with risk, what it does to the psychological framework through which you see opportunity. When you spend years being told that safety is the goal, that caution is virtue, that protecting what you have is wisdom, you don't just adopt those behaviors. You internalize them as identity. You start to see people who take calculated financial risks not as strategic thinkers, but as reckless gamblers. You start to see the accumulation of assets and equity not as the normal, expected behavior of a financially literate adult, but as something only special, lucky, or ruthless people do. You make yourself psychologically ineligible for wealth building before you've even started. This is the trap inside the trap. The financial advice doesn't just limit your strategy, it limits your self-concept. And a limited self-concept is infinitely more powerful than any external limitation. There's a psychological phenomenon studied extensively in behavioral economics called loss aversion. The research, pioneered by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, demonstrated that humans feel the pain of a loss approximately twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain. This is hardwired into human psychology, and the entire architecture of safe financial advice is designed, whether intentionally or not, to activate this loss aversion at maximum intensity. Every piece of advice is framed around what you might lose, never what you might build, stay out of debt, don't take risks, protect your credit score, build an emergency fund, save for a rainy day. Every single phrase is a loss framing, and loss-framed thinking produces loss-focused behavior, which produces exactly the kind of cautious, minimal return financial life that the advice was supposedly designed to prevent. Meanwhile, the people who actually build wealth are doing something psychologically different. They're not reckless. They're not gambling. They're operating from a gain orientation, constantly asking not, how do I avoid losing what I have, but how do I build what I want? That is a fundamentally different cognitive posture, and it produces fundamentally different results. Let's talk about debt for a moment, because the conventional wisdom here is particularly revealing. Debt is bad. That's the lesson. Avoid debt. Pay off debt as quickly as possible. Being debt-free is the goal. This sounds so reasonable that questioning it almost feels irresponsible. But let's look at what actually happens in the financial lives of people who build significant wealth. According to a 2023 study published in the Journal of Financial Economics, over 73% of millionaires in the United States carry some form of debt. Not because they failed to pay it off, but because they made a deliberate strategic choice to use leverage. Because they understood something that the debt is bad narrative conveniently obscures. There are two completely different types of debt. There is consumer debt, which buys you things that lose value, extracts interest, and produces nothing. And there is leverage, which funds the acquisition of assets that generate returns exceeding the cost of borrowing. The person who borrows $300,000 at 6% interest to buy a rental property that generates $2,400 per month in rental income, while appreciating in value, is not making the same decision as the person who puts $30,000 on a credit card for a vacation. These are not equivalent. But the blanket debt is bad narrative treats them as if they are. And in doing so, it psychologically seals off an entire category of wealth-building strategy from the people who most need access to it. Here's the uncomfortable question that this raises. Who benefits from a population that is deeply averse to leverage? Who benefits from workers who prioritize being debt-free over accumulating assets? Who benefits from a middle class that hoards cash in savings accounts, with negligible real returns rather than deploying capital into appreciating assets? The answer isn't complicated. Financial institutions earn their profits from the spread between what they pay you on your deposits and what they charge others to borrow. The lower your financial literacy, the more you rely on products that serve the institution rather than products that serve you. A population trained to fear debt and celebrate savings accounts is, from the perspective of the financial services industry, an ideal customer base. Predictable, compliant, profitable. This is not a conspiracy. It's a structural incentive. And structural incentives shape culture far more powerfully and far more invisibly than any deliberate plan ever could. Now let's bring this into sharper focus. If you're watching this and you've spent years following conventional financial advice, the question that's probably forming in your mind right now is, how do the people who actually build wealth think about this differently? What's the actual alternative? The answer starts with a single conceptual shift that changes everything downstream. The financially average person thinks about money in terms of income and expenses. Money comes in, money goes out. The goal is to have more coming in than going out and to protect what remains. This is linear financial thinking, and it has a ceiling built directly into it because it treats your own labor as the only engine of financial growth you have access to. The person building real wealth thinks about money in terms of assets and cash flow. Every financial decision is evaluated through the lens of whether it increases or decreases your base of productive assets, not whether it feels safe, not whether it minimizes risk in the short term, but whether it is moving you closer to or further from a portfolio of assets that generates income independent of your direct labor. This is not an abstract philosophical difference. It has enormous practical implications. Consider how this shift changes something as basic as a career decision. The linear thinker evaluates a job offer based primarily on salary. The asset and cash flow thinker evaluates it based on salary, equity, skill accumulation, network access, and optionality. They're looking at the same opportunity through a completely different lens and seeing completely different things. Consider how it changes a housing decision. The linear thinker asks, "Can I afford the monthly payment?" The asset-oriented thinker asks, "Is this a productive use of capital relative to alternatives? Would the down payment generate better returns deployed elsewhere? Does the property have rental income potential? What's the long-term appreciation trajectory of this market?" Same decision, completely different analysis, completely different long-term outcome. The reason most people never make this shift is not intelligence. The research is clear and consistent on this. Wealth is not strongly correlated with IQ or formal education. What it is correlated with is financial literacy, specifically the kind of financial literacy that challenges conventional narratives rather than reinforcing them. And this is where we have to talk about the role of formal financial education, or, rather, the almost complete absence of it. In the United States, as of 2024, only 25 states require high school students to take a personal finance course before graduation. The content of those courses, where they exist, focuses overwhelmingly on budgeting, avoiding debt, and basic savings principles. There is virtually no instruction on investing, equity building, asset allocation, tax strategy, or the mechanics of wealth accumulation. The curriculum was designed for a different era and a different economy, and it has not meaningfully evolved. What this means in practice is that the vast majority of people enter adult financial life with a framework built around minimum viable financial survival rather than strategic wealth building. They know how to balance a checkbook. They do not know how compound interest in an equity portfolio differs from compound interest in a savings account. They know that debt is dangerous. They do not know that leveraged capital deployed intelligently is one of the primary mechanisms through which generational wealth is built. They were taught how not to fail. They were never taught how to win. And this gap in financial education is not neutral. It has a compounding effect over decades that is staggering in its implications. A 22-year-old who understands index fund investing and begins deploying $500 per month at that age will accumulate dramatically different wealth by age 62 than an identical person who begins at 32 with the same contribution. We know this. The math of compound growth is not secret. It is taught in high school mathematics. But the application of that math to personal wealth building strategy is systematically absent from financial education. And the result is that people learn the math too late, after a decade of compounding has already been lost. The cost of that lost decade, by conservative estimates, is approximately $400,000 to $600,000 in foregone wealth for an average earner. Not because they were lazy, not because they were careless, because nobody told them. Let's talk about the final and most psychologically sophisticated layer of this problem. Even when people become aware that conventional financial advice is inadequate, most of them still don't change their behavior. Not meaningfully, not consistently, and the reason is not lack of information, the reason is social identity. Human beings are deeply social creatures. Our financial behaviors are not primarily driven by rational calculation. They are driven by the behaviors of the people around us, by the norms of our social group, by the desire to be seen as responsible and normal by the people whose opinion matters to us. And for most people, The financial behaviors that their social group considers normal are exactly the behaviors that produce average outcomes. Think about how this plays out in real life. You're at a family gathering. Someone mentions they've started investing. The response from the group is often some version of caution. Are you sure that's safe? The market can crash. I know someone who lost everything. What if you need that money? Nobody says this to be malicious. They say it because it reflects the genuine belief system of their social world. But what this means is that every time you contemplate a meaningful shift in your financial behavior, your social environment will produce friction. Low-grade, well-intentioned friction that over time is extraordinarily effective at keeping you aligned with the average. This is why genuine financial transformation almost always comes bundled with some degree of social discomfort. Not because wealth building requires antisocial behavior, but because it requires deviation from the norms of your existing social world. And deviation from social norms triggers the same psychological discomfort as physical threat for most people. The brain doesn't easily distinguish between the two. The people who navigate this successfully don't do it by becoming isolated or by rejecting their communities. They do it by consciously expanding their social environment to include people who have already made the financial shifts they're attempting. They understand that exposure to different financial norms changes what feels normal, and what feels normal determines behavior far more powerfully than what feels logical. This is the final piece of the picture. And it's the most important one. Because everything else in this video, the math, the strategy, the structural critique of conventional advice, is information. And information alone almost never changes. Behavior. What changes behavior is identity shift. Feeling that a different kind of financial life is available to you, that it's normal, that the people who pursue it are not exceptional or lucky or reckless. They're just operating with a different set of tools and a different set of assumptions. You were handed a set of financial assumptions before you were old enough to evaluate them critically. Those assumptions were sincerely passed down by people who believed in them. And those assumptions, however well-intentioned, were structurally calibrated to produce average outcomes in an economic environment that no longer exists. That's not a reason for anger. It's a reason for clarity. The goal of this video was never to make you cynical about financial advice in general. It was to make you precise about which advice serves you and which advice serves the system you're navigating. Because there is a difference. And that difference, pursued with consistency over a long enough timeline, is the difference between financial mediocrity and financial freedom. Let's bring this home. You started this video being told that the advice, designed to keep you safe, was actually designed to keep you average. Now you understand why. The architecture of conventional financial guidance was built for a different era, maintained by structural incentives that favor institutions over individuals, reinforced by a formal education system that was never designed to create financially sophisticated adults and locked in place by the social dynamics of the communities we belong to. The way out isn't complicated, but it is demanding. It requires you to look at every piece of financial advice you've internalized and ask a single question. Whose outcome does this serve? Not whether it sounds responsible. Not whether people you respect believe it. Whose outcome does it actually produce when followed consistently over 20 years? Some of what you've been taught will survive that question. Some of it won't. And the pieces that don't survive it, the reflexive debt avoidance, the savings account as investment mentality, the risk as danger framing, those are the exact pieces you need to replace with something more precise, more strategic, and are more aligned with the actual mechanics of how wealth is built in a modern economy. The system was never going to tell you this, but now you know. If this video shifted something in the way you think about money, subscribe to FinTrove. Every week we go deeper into the financial frameworks that actually work. The ones you weren't taught in school, the ones the industry doesn't advertise, and the ones that consistently separate the people who build real wealth from the people, who spend their entire lives wondering why they never got ahead despite doing everything right. The next video is going to go even further. You won't want to miss it.